The world felt smaller in those days. It was a time of great progress but also great fear. We had split the atom, we had unlocked the power of the sun, but this power was a double-edged sword. It could light up a city, or it could wipe it off the map in a blinding flash. Nuclear weapons were the ghost at the feast of modern life. Everyone knew they existed. The big powers, America and the Soviet Union, had thousands of them. They were pointed at each other, ready to fly at a moment's notice. This wasn't a war fought with soldiers in trenches. This was a war that could be over in an afternoon, leaving behind only shadows and dust. This constant threat was called the Cold War. It was a strange kind of conflict. There were no big declared battles between the two superpowers. Instead, it was a war of spies, of secrets, and of influence. It was a chess game played on a global board. Each side tried to gain an advantage. They built bigger and better bombs. They developed faster planes and more accurate missiles. School children practiced hiding under their desks. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. The fear was real. It was a quiet, humming anxiety in the background of everyday life. People wondered if they would wake up tomorrow. The world was holding its breath, waiting for a mistake. The leaders of these two powerful nations held the fate of the world in their hands. In America, there was a young, energetic president. In the Soviet Union, there was a tough, unpredictable premier. They were like two giants standing on a fragile piece of glass. Any wrong move could shatter everything. The political tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every international event, every small skirmish in a faraway country was seen through the lens of this rivalry. It was a time of black and white, us versus them. There was very little room for gray. The stakes were simply too high for misunderstanding or error. The weapons themselves were terrifying things. They had names like Titan and Minuteman. They were housed in underground silos, deep in the American heartland or scattered across the vast Russian plains. These missiles could cross continents in less than an hour. They carried warheads many times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The logic was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It meant that if one side launched its missiles, the other side would launch its own in return. The result would be total annihilation for both. It was a terrible, frightening kind of peace, balanced on the tip of a nuclear warhead. Into this tense world stepped John F. Kennedy. He was young, handsome, and full of promise. He spoke of a new frontier. He inspired a generation with his call to public service. When he became president in 1961, he brought a sense of vigor and hope to the White House. But he also inherited the immense pressures of the Cold War. He was a new player in a very old and dangerous game. His opponent, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, was a seasoned, tough-as-nails politician. Khrushchev saw Kennedy's youth and perhaps mistook it for weakness. The new president would be tested, and the test would come quickly and without mercy. Not far from the coast of Florida, there was an island nation called Cuba. For many years, America had a strong influence there. It was a place for vacationers, for business, and for a friendly government. But things had changed dramatically. A revolution had swept through the island. A young, charismatic leader named Fidel Castro had taken power. He promised a better life for the Cuban people. He spoke of justice and equality. At first, many in America were unsure what to make of him. But it soon became clear that Castro's vision for Cuba was very different from America's. He was a revolutionary, and his revolution was just getting started. Castro began to change Cuba from top to bottom. He took over private businesses and large farms, many of them owned by Americans. He announced that Cuba was a socialist state. This was a big problem for the United States, a socialist country friendly with the Soviet Union just 90 miles from American shores. To leaders in Washington, this was like having an enemy outpost right on their doorstep. It was unacceptable. The fear was that Cuba would become a base for spreading Soviet-style communism throughout Latin America. The beautiful island paradise had suddenly become a major strategic threat in the middle of the Cold War. President Kennedy and his advisors felt they had to do something. The idea of a communist Cuba was a political firestorm. It challenged the Monroe Doctrine, a long-standing American policy that opposed European interference in the Americas. The pressure to act was immense, both from the public and from within the government. Kennedy was caught between a rock and a hard place. He had to look strong against communism. He had to show Khrushchev that he was not a pushover. But any action he took against Cuba was risky. It could lead to a bigger conflict, one that might pull in the Soviet Union and its powerful military. The stage was set for a confrontation. The American government had a plan. It was a secret plan, hatched by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. The idea was to train a small army of Cuban exiles, people who had fled Castro's revolution. These exiles would then land on the shores of Cuba and spark an uprising against Castro. The hope was that the Cuban people would join them and overthrow the new government. It seemed like a clever way to solve the Cuba problem without using American soldiers directly. The plan was approved and the exiles were trained in secret camps. The landing spot was a remote swampy area on the southern coast of Cuba, known as the Bay of Pigs. In April of 1961, the invasion began. It was a disaster from the very start. Nothing went according to plan. The element of surprise was lost. The expected air support from the U.S. was limited and ineffective. Castro's forces were well prepared and knew the invasion was coming. The Cuban people did not rise up to join the invaders. Instead, they rallied behind Castro to defend their country. The small band of exiles was quickly surrounded on the beaches. They fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Within 3 days, the invasion was completely crushed. The surviving invaders were captured and paraded on Cuban television. The failure at the Bay of Pigs was a huge embarrassment for President Kennedy and the United States. It made the new president look weak and inexperienced on the world stage. He had to go on television and take full responsibility for the fiasco. For Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow, it was a great victory. He mocked the Americans and their failed attempt to turn back the Cuban Revolution. The incident showed the world that America was not invincible. It also proved to Castro that he could not trust his powerful neighbor to the north. He believed, with good reason, that the Americans would surely try to invade again, and next time they might use their own army. This fear pushed Fidel Castro directly into the arms of the Soviet Union. He needed a powerful friend, a protector who could stand up to the United States. Khrushchev was more than willing to play that role. He saw a golden opportunity. By forming a strong alliance with Cuba, he could gain a valuable foothold in the Western Hemisphere. It was a major strategic prize. The Soviet Union began sending massive amounts of aid to Cuba. They sent weapons, supplies, and military advisors. The bond between Moscow and Havana grew stronger by the day. The failed invasion had the exact opposite effect of what America wanted. It made Cuba a more dangerous and committed enemy. The Cold War was a game of power and perception. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a dangerous arms race. America had placed its own nuclear missiles in countries like Turkey and Italy. These missiles were very close to the Soviet Union. They could strike major Soviet cities, including Moscow, with very little warning. This made Khrushchev and his military planners extremely nervous. They felt surrounded and vulnerable. They believed the strategic balance was tipped in America's favor. Khrushchev was a proud man, and he was determined to even the score. He wanted to give the Americans a taste of their own medicine. An idea began to form in Khrushchev's mind. It was a bold and incredibly risky idea. What if he could secretly place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba? It would be the perfect countermove. From Cuba, Soviet missiles could reach almost every major city in the United States, from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles. It would dramatically change the balance of power overnight. It would force the Americans to feel the same fear that the Soviets felt every day. For Khrushchev, it was also a way to protect his new ally, Fidel Castro. He believed that with Soviet missiles on the island, the United States would never dare to invade Cuba again. The plan was given a code name, Operation Anadir. It was a masterpiece of deception. The secrecy was absolute. Soviet soldiers were told they were going to a cold Arctic region. They were issued skis and winter parkas to maintain the illusion. The missiles and all their supporting equipment were disguised as ordinary commercial cargo. They were loaded onto dozens of ships that sailed from Soviet ports. The captains of these ships were not even told their final destination until they were already far out at sea. They sailed across the Atlantic, pretending to be on routine journeys, all while carrying the most destructive weapons known to man in their holds. Slowly and secretly, the ships began to arrive in Cuba throughout the summer and early fall of 1962. Under the cover of night, the Soviet military began the massive task of unloading the cargo. They worked quickly, trying to build the missile launch sites before anyone noticed. The equipment included medium-range ballistic missiles, which could travel over 1,000 miles, and intermediate-range missiles, which could travel much farther. They also brought bomber planes, patrol boats, and thousands of Soviet troops to guard the sites. It was a massive and daring gamble. Khrushchev was rolling the dice, betting that he could present the world with a done deal before President Kennedy even knew what was happening. The United States was not completely blind. For months, there had been whispers and intelligence reports about a Soviet military buildup in Cuba. CIA reports mentioned increased ship traffic and the arrival of military technicians. But the true nature of the buildup remained a mystery. Some analysts thought it was just defensive weapons to protect Castro. President Kennedy even issued a public warning to the Soviets, stating that if they ever placed offensive weapons in Cuba, the gravest issues would arise. The Soviets lied directly to the Americans, assuring them that they had no intention of doing such a thing. They insisted all their aid to Cuba was purely for defense. To get a clearer picture, the Americans relied on a special kind of spy plane, the U-2. These planes could fly at incredible altitudes more than 13 miles high, far above the reach of Cuban air defenses. From that height, they could take incredibly detailed photographs of the ground below. On the morning of October 14, 1962, a U-2 plane piloted by Major Richard Heiser flew a mission over western Cuba. The weather was clear. His cameras clicked away, capturing thousands of images on long rolls of film. After he landed safely, the film was rushed to Washington for analysis. What the photo interpreters found would trigger the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War. In a sterile room, analysts hunched over large light tables, looking at the black and white images frame by frame. They were experts at identifying military hardware from above. Suddenly, one of them spotted something familiar and terrifying. In a clearing cut into the Cuban landscape, they saw the unmistakable shapes of launch pads, missile erectors, and fuel trailers for medium-range ballistic missiles. There was no doubt about what they were. The Soviets were not just sending anti-aircraft guns, they were installing nuclear missiles capable of striking the United States. The secret was out. The worst fears of the American government had come true. The news was delivered to President Kennedy on the morning of October 16th. His national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, brought the photos to him in his bedroom. The president was calm, but the gravity of the situation was immense. He immediately called a meeting of his most trusted advisors. This small, secret group would come to be known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. They gathered in the cabinet room of the White House, the U-2 photos spread out on the table before them. The world did not know it yet, but it was standing on the brink of nuclear war. The clock was ticking. For 13 days the world held its breath as the crisis unfolded. President Kennedy and his EXCOM advisors met in secret, day and night, debating what to do. The choices were all bad. Some of his military advisors, like the Air Force General Curtis LeMay, argued for an immediate and massive airstrike to destroy the missile sites. This would be followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. They believed that this was the only way to remove the threat decisively. But this was an incredibly risky path. An attack on the Soviet sites would kill Soviet soldiers. How would Khrushchev respond? Would he launch his own missiles from the Soviet Union? It could easily trigger a full-scale nuclear war. Another option was to do nothing, or to use quiet diplomacy through the United Nations, but this seemed too weak. It would allow the Soviets to finish building the sites and make the missiles operational. Politically, Kennedy could not afford to look like he was backing down. It would be seen as a major defeat for the United States. The pressure on the young president was unimaginable. He knew that a single wrong decision could lead to the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. He had to find a way to get the missiles out of Cuba without starting World War III. He needed a middle path, a response that was strong but not an act of war. After days of intense debate, Kennedy decided on a course of action. He would not launch an immediate attack. Instead, he would implement a naval quarantine around Cuba. He carefully chose the word quarantine instead of blockade, because a blockade is legally considered an act of war. On the evening of October 22, President Kennedy went on national television and spoke to the American people and the world. He revealed the existence of the missiles. He showed the U-2 photos as proof. He announced the quarantine, declaring that the U.S. Navy would stop and inspect any ships heading to Cuba to ensure they were not carrying offensive weapons. The world listened in stunned silence. The two superpowers were now on a direct collision course. American military forces around the globe were placed on high alert, DEFCON 2, the highest level short of actual war. B-52 bombers carrying nuclear weapons were in the air 24 hours a day. Soviet ships carrying more missile parts were steaming towards the quarantine line. For several terrifying days, the planet watched and waited. Would the Soviet ships try to run the quarantine? Would the American Navy fire on them? It was the ultimate game of chicken, played with the fate of humanity as the prize. The world had never been closer to the brink of oblivion.